Today, I'll start to describe some of the data points that would hopefully help us understand some of the drivers of immigration attitudes in the United States. As the latter question showed us, the division in the country around this particular issue is incredibly stark compared to 2 decades ago. And to Denzel's point, there is a much more meta and a bigger way to assess what is happening in this country, and hopefully ways for us to all move forward. So the next 3 photographs I'm going through are folks from a particular set of segments that we call the exhaustive majority. These are individuals who are open to compromise on issues like immigration. They're often sympathetic to the issues and the circumstances of immigrants and refugees and asylees, but they're also exhausted by the political environment. They distrust politicians and those who have historically held positions of power in this country, not only in sort of the political environment, but also academia and otherwise. And these are individuals that were tested all across our 8,000 sample size study. And these folks were covered in a piece by the New York Times not too long ago. So just a brief agenda, just going to introduce more in common what we do, America's 7 tribes, differences across issues specifically focusing on immigration and some of the predictability factors around our segmentation, the dimension of our hidden architecture. These are the core beliefs that effectively move people or lean people into having the political attitudes and perceptions that they do around issues of immigration. Do a bit of a deeper dive into the differences between what we call the wings versus the exhaustive majority, and then land on some conclusions, some insights, some practical guides moving forward. So we're having lots of debates around the world around national identity and immigration, but this is often linked to a much wider backlash against globalization and the status quo. More in common globally and here in the United States is trying to understand what the key drivers of this disruption are. And it is our belief that in order to move forward on any one of the issues that we're dealing with in the United States and across the globe, the more meta frame is often tribalization and polarization, because that's the lens through which people start to develop some of their more ingrained, deep political attitudes that they often hold. We've done work across the Netherlands, Germany, Italy, and France. I'm not going to bore you with some of the data here, but more or less, the phenomenon that we're seeing in the US has much more global, it's much more applicable globally as well. And this phenomenon isn't just contained to our borders. We were established in 2017 with the goal of strengthening our society, and so we do this work often in each of the countries that we have offices in by conducting what we call national segmentation studies. We then work off of those studies in order to build narrative initiatives and programs, but also programmatic work that helps to facilitate social connection. And we currently have partnerships with a number of international groups all across the world, but also here in the United States, we're working with a key number of civil society partners. And so here we go. So Hidden Tribes of America is a project of More in Common. It's a year-long project for us to better understand the forces that are driving political polarization in this country. It's based off of a large-scale sampling of about 8,000 Americans interlocked with census data. The study provides a much deeper analysis because it gleans insights from dimensions of social science and social psychology. The segmentation itself, I have the slide in the appendix specifically on the methodology of the research. I know sometimes people have a lot of questions around that, but more specifically, it was an 8,000 sample size. We asked a number of questions, over close to 150 different questions on race, your attitudes towards immigration, gender equality, religion, etc. We then asked a number of what we call core belief questions. And these questions were the ones that were used to eventually identify the 7 segments that I'll present in the next slide. There was no use of demographic data in creating the segmentation itself. And the Hidden Tribes study forms the initial phase of this project. And in fact, in a couple of months, we're going to be releasing an immigration-specific paper, which I'm happy to let this network know as soon as we do. And I'm sure our relationship with Immigration Learning, the Immigration Learning Center, will be able to do that and facilitate that moving forward. So America's 7 tribes. So across the country, 7 segments. I just want you to focus on the ends. So the far left segment is a progressive activist segment, highly engaged, over 80% white, incredibly educated, um, um, quite politically active, and they're about 8% of the US population. And then like the wing on the more sort of conservative side of the segmentation, the traditional and devoted conservatives are 25% of the US population, with an exhaustive majority that I just mentioned, who are generally exhausted by the political environment. And it begins from traditional liberal all the way up to moderates. And I'm going to go into a little bit of specific demographic data on these folks. So progressive activists are younger, they're highly engaged, they're more cosmopolitan, generally angry. Traditional liberal groups who hold similar views as progressive activists, just with less intensity. They're a bit older, a bit more open to compromise, and quite rational. If you want a more simplified distinction between the two, progressive activists, you can think of them as sort of in 2015 and 16 to be sort of Bernie Sanders supporters per se, and traditional liberals are those who were, say, activated by Obama's presidency in 08. So, and then you have a passive liberal group who's younger, unhappy, insecure, shows low levels of political engagement, distrustful, and disillusioned. A politically disengaged group. This is a group that's quite dangerous in this country because they are about 26% of the US population. They're younger, they're lower income, they're quite distrustful and conspiratorial, and they lean towards authoritarian messaging. And so what we're doing at More in Common is trying to better understand this particular segment, because if they were to be politically activated, there could be quite a bit of consequence for the country politically and socially. A moderate group, think you're moderate voters across the Midwest and across the Sun Belt. They come right down the middle on a number of issues. They're more middle civic minded but also generally pessimistic about where we are as a country. And then a traditional and devoted conservative group that's more religious, patriotic, moralistic, and the difference between traditional and devoted conservatives, because folks have those questions sometimes. Traditional conservatives show less intensity around issues of race and immigration, not by much. Whereas progressive activists and traditional liberals, the difference there is actually traditional liberals have more of a tendency to believe that we can compromise in a country and that we can eventually come together, whereas progressive activists are fairly extreme in their sort of liberal sort of mindset. So the differences across current issues. So effectively, most public opinion research in the United States, when it's done, it often uses demographic data. And you generally see quite a bimodal split, 50-50, 50% of Americans believe that immigration is good for America versus it being bad for America. Well, when you run the segmentation across the segments, you see a far different picture. You see a society that is split and torn apart on the wings, and then in an exhaustive majority segment that segments within the exhaustive majority that have conflicting views on this issue of immigration impact. Is immigration good for America? Progressive activists, 99% of progressive activists believe that immigration is good for America. Whereas devoted and traditional conservatives come in about 90 and 72% believing that nowadays immigration is bad for America, stripping the welfare system of its resources. And you see the same thing going on with questions around sexual harassment, white privilege, Islamophobia. And so the hidden tribes analysis is remarkably effective in predicting people's views across a number of issue areas. On this issue of immigration, and this is some good news, most people across our segmentation believe, including actually sort of like politically disengaged coming in at above 50%, believing that people should be able to take refuge in other countries, including the United States. But where the country differs around some of its perceptions and attitudes, specifically on this, they believe that the refugee screening process is not tough enough. And so this speaks as much to our ability as an ecosystem to tell this story in a way that captures not only the attitudes of the folks within our segmentation and across other segmentations that have been done across the country, but it also speaks to our necessity to speak to people's core beliefs and dimensions of social psychology, which I'll go into in just a little bit. So tribe membership having high predictability across political issues better than, say, standard categories. On, say, DACA, if you use strong Democrat and Hispanic as, say, sort of an affiliation, 86% of strong Democrats believe that undocumented immigrants who arrived as children should be able to stay here in the United States, versus 99% of progressive activists. And if you look at strong Republicans, they come in at 67%, believing that the government should be able to deport anyone living in America. Devoted conservatives in our segmentation believe that to be 72%. And so we're continuing to evolve the predictability of our analysis. But what we've come to understand is that using the segmentation, deriving from dimensions of social psychology, is quite effective in doing more strategic targeting to specific populations across this country. So like I said, like some of the dimensions of hidden architecture. So the hidden tribes, like I said, show the importance of core beliefs, but not just race, gender, and class. The public opinion research often presents its key insights through these lenses. Attitudinal segmentation shows that other factors can be more powerful. Values of authority, purity, people's perception of threat. And so people's views are shaped by their values about personal responsibility and authoritarianism, and core beliefs often cuts right across these visible traits. So the most potent core beliefs that most relate to attitudes or most dictate attitudes around immigration are group identity and tribalism, perceived threat or perception of threat, and then moral foundation theory. So on American identity, the feeling of losing one's identity and often a human need for belonging can influence people's views on immigration. 68% of Americans in our study believe that American identity is disappearing, and this is on a national scale. And with only 32% agreeing that it is being strengthened through diversity. Progressive activists and traditional liberals believe that American identity is strengthened by diversity, whereas only 32% of traditional conservatives and only 10% of devoted conservatives believe that American identity is strengthened. Folks across the exhaustive majority, including the politically disengaged, the passive liberals, and the moderates, mostly believe that American identity is disappearing. And so this isn't just a phenomenon that is occurring on folks who hold more intense conservative views, but generally is happening across the middle in this country. And so what does it mean to be American? What is American identity? Well, is it to be able to speak English, to be Christian, to be born in America? And progressive activists believe all of this to be on the lower end. 22% of progressive activists believe American identity is closely related to being able to speak English, whereas devoted conservatives come in at 96% on that. The traditional conservatives come in at 91. But if you look at the passive liberal segment onwards to the right, generally more than 50%, more than 65% or more folks believe that American identity is deeply tied to your ability to be able to speak English. Christianity coming in at 53 and 62% within the devoted conservative wing, and then being born in America is at a national scale comes in at about 50%. 50% of Americans across our segment believe to be born in America is to be American. Perception of threat. If you have a high regard for authority and rule of law, and you have a high sense of perceived threat, you most often oppose illegal immigration in this country. And so if you show lower levels of perception of threat, such as the traditional liberal group and the devoted conservative and the progressive activist group, you generally are more open to, say, illegal immigration specifically, and of course legal. So moral foundation theory. And so here's where you see some stark differences amongst the progressive activist group and the devoted conservative group. I know it doesn't seem like that, say, on purity or authority, but these markers are quite exponential when you dig into the deeper data set. On authority, progressive activists are incredibly high on care, for instance, whereas devoted conservatives are incredibly high on purity and then fairness. Part of what we're doing is trying to assess exactly how folks define fairness, for instance, or loyalty to America. And that is a piece of research that we'll be releasing in subsequent months. So some practical guides, some language frameworks. Progressive activists and traditional liberals frame immigration issues through the lenses of racism, refugee protection, the value of a diverse society, like I showed a couple slides ago. Devoted and traditional conservatives frame immigration issues by immigrants defying laws, values of authority, losing control of borders, partly because immigration has become a proxy not only for it has become a proxy for national security and national sovereignty. And then devoted traditional conservative groups have quite a bit of doubt of an immigrant's loyalty to America. And the exhaustive majority are split all across the middle. And so let me just Let me jump to specifically connecting across the lines of difference. So the ultimate winners from polarization and social fracturing are those who drive this us versus them narratives. And to advance inclusive values requires essential social cohesion. We're convinced that in order to do this, a key element is to build a new inclusive sense of national identity. How does one do that? Like the middle, the exhausted majority doesn't want the status quo. They want change. They want to feel heard and respected, and they want a sense of status. They want to feel empowered and want agency. Experts are to be distrusted, specifically the views of the exhausted majority, and the most credible messengers are often people like them in spaces like where they are. They often want a sense of belonging in order to build what we're calling a bigger us. And so how do you do that? Well, speak to the need of belonging and identity. Try not to fact check emotions. Instead, try to speak to people's values and cultures and to their emotions more intimately. Try to address concerns of corruption. Take note of what they're saying, because often many people feel quite judged. And we have some data points around political correctness, which I can share with you afterwards. It would be helpful to avoid maligning patriotism, healthy pride, and national identity, speaking to people's loss of agency, and of course, forging new coalitions with unusual alliances, but not only across our ecosystem, but within the practical sort of strategic work that you all are doing across the country.